Hi, this is Dr. P to talk about combat, melee versus firepower. This is a fundamental difference in how warfare has been conducted over time. And you can consider that difference when you make up your combat resolution methods. It depends partly on the scale. Melee is relatively simple. Until the last few centuries, of course, melee combat was the norm. In melee, you can only hurt those within your reach. Now, you might say, what about bows? Bows have more reach, but they have rarely been decisive in warfare. There are a few exceptions like horse archers, English longbows, perhaps crossbows occasionally. Even then, we're talking a range of a couple hundred yards, which in many ways is within reach. Melee tends to be a long slog where few are actually killed until one side breaks. Then the major casualties occur during the pursuit. The result is that in a battle, the casualties can be very disproportionate between the winner and the loser. They can have approximately equal numbers, but the winner can have a lot fewer casualties than the loser because of all the casualties inflicted during pursuit. Even in the gunpowder age up through musketry, this was still generally true. There weren't as many battles where one side broke in the gunpowder age, partly I think because there were more professional armies. Now, with the advent of what we'll call firepower weapons, long-range weapons, things change. Artillery becomes the major killer, far more than anything else, far more than bullets, for example. A disproportionate number of people, even in World War II, were killed by artillery. Artillery dominated the battlefield even in Napoleonic times. Casualties in a battle involving firepower tend to be much greater than a melee battle, and they tend to be proportional to the firepower. Pursuit is still important if it's a set-piece battle, but much less so the bigger and bigger the battle gets. Pursuit also rarely results in the wild slaughter or capture of the losing side, which was common in the days of swords and spears. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps it's because the artillery was so slow to pursue, so it couldn't be involved. But it's also because of professional military organization, where a pursuit wasn't always a rout. So this brings us to F.W. Lanchester's research in World War I. He was a British researcher. And he came up with his linear law for melee combat and his square law for firepower combat. Now, these are mechanical calculations. They don't account for morale. They don't account for perception and the psychological. They're just, here's the mechanical set, ignoring all those other factors. In the linear law for melee, the observation is that one man can hurt only one man at a time. So a force's strength is directly proportional to its numbers. A force that's twice as strong in numbers is also twice as strong in combat power. Now, we can quibble about that because the force that's twice as strong will not have twice as long a line probably in an old-fashioned battle. Nonetheless, this is the formula, and it makes a lot of sense. Now, if you're going to use that in deterministic combat, this would mean that each unit would inflict a hit, and then the question would be, how many hits does it take to kill a unit? 2 hits to kill a unit, 3 hits to kill a unit? I've done it both ways, and it can work in different situations both ways. And it could even be 4 or 5, something like that. Now, in contrast, we have the square law. A force's strength now is proportional to the square of its numbers. So, in melee, if your numbers are 6 to 3, then the larger force is twice the strength of the smaller. In the era of firepower, it becomes 36 to 9, 4 times the strength, which is quite a different proportion. And there's a formula which will enable you to calculate how many units remain in the larger force after the smaller force has been wiped out. And a table on the next slide shows results when the two forces fight to a finish. Notice when I show this slide, even in the case of 20 versus 19, which seems like a very small advantage, approximately 5%, it means that 6 of the attackers will remain when all of the defenders are dead. Again, this table is a fight to the finish, and that's not normally how things are done. So where does the square law apply? Well, at some large scale, we revert to something much more linear because we're way beyond the range of the firepower, if the firepower, say, is artillery. And there's also, in age of firepower, the overall advantage of being on the defensive, of having cover, of being able to surprise the attacker. Now, in days of melee, you tended to have set-piece battles where one side would not fight if the other side had a great advantage in terrain. So they typically fought where neither side had much of an advantage in terrain. But on a strategic scale, terrain or cover becomes important. Also consider that morale is much more important than the physical in warfare, and so when you get to a large scale, the square law doesn't apply to nearly the extent that it does on a smaller scale. On the other hand, no amount of good morale is going to protect you from the enemy artillery, or from the enemy bombers, as the case may be. So, keep these differences and formulas in mind when you devise combat methods. Nonetheless, in the end, if it's me, I'm going to pick a method that's best for the gameplay, whether it's entirely realistic or not.